Hey, welcome back to Last Call Baseball, episode 156. I'm Dorian. I love what Reggie Jackson said before the Rickwood Field baseball game last week about the racism that he experienced as a young baseball player playing in, Alabama, Mississippi, just basically all through the South in the late 1960s. In living memory, that was some strong words, and I applaud MLB and Fox for not cutting him off. Because obviously that wasn't pleasant, but you can tell it's been in his heart for a long time. I encourage you to go on YouTube or anywhere else to see what Reggie Jackson had to say about what he had to go through as a young man in a different time in this country. And completely pivoting away from baseball in this country, I want to go back a little bit earlier in the year. I went to a whole bunch and watched a whole mess of games from the Serie del Caribe, the Caribbean series, which is usually the countries in the Caribbean playing the international baseball tournament every year. So it's the winter champion from Mexico, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Panama, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic. Great atmosphere. It's basically like in Europe, the Champions League, the champions of England, the champions of Spain, the champions of Italy and Portugal all play in a season-long tournament. But for the Serie del Caribe, it's all condensed to like 2 weeks of this tournament. Everyone plays each other. Some people go to the knockout round. Someone gets crowned the champion. Kind of like the best baseball club in the Caribbean, right? Next year, the Serie del Caribe is going to be hosted by a town in Mexico called Mexicali. Prior to that announcement, I had never heard of Mexicali, but it's going to get played there. Apparently, Mexicali is about like a 5-hour drive from Tijuana/San Diego. The powers that be over at the Caribbean Baseball Association, whatever they call themselves, they said, we have a big announcement. Stay tuned. And so they went to the press conference and they announced that for the 2025 Caribbean Series, Serie del Caribe, Japan, the champion of Japan, is going to play in the Caribbean Series. You can imagine the response of people saying, huh? Say what? When in the world did the island of Japan magically float down into the Caribbean? Everyone knows Japan's an amazing baseball country, but why in the world did these people invite who would be the champion of the Nippon? I believe it's the Nippon Professional Baseball League to play in the Caribbean Series with all these Spanish-speaking countries. It makes no sense. And on top of that, to make matters even worse, the organizers left out Nicaragua, Panama, Colombia, Curacao, and Cuba. People were like, this makes zero sense. This year, it was 7 clubs, the 7 champions of the nations in the Caribbean. This year, it's only 4 plus Japan. So the only countries that are going to be represented in Mexicali next year are Mexico, Puerto Rico, Venezuela, Dominican Republic, and Japan. I really hope their Japanese players bone up on Spanish, because I know none of these people are going to be learning Japanese. It doesn't make any sense. I really wanted to go to the 2025 Serie del Caribe tournament, but now it seems like it's a fiasco. And we don't always talk about Major League Baseball. You know that. We talk about minor league, we talk about international, and I just want to tell you I am frustrated with the organizers of the Caribbean Baseball Association, whatever they call themselves. Welcome Japan to the Caribbean. So now you know during wintertime, because right now it's basically hot as heck everywhere, but in the wintertime, remember, book your flights to the Caribbean island of Japan. When you go to games, whether it's an international game, whether it's a game at Rickwood Field, you're always being sold merchandise, t-shirts, hats, stickers, ice cream helmets. The other day, I went to the MLB shop, the official flagship MLB shop. Looking around, I did something very 1990s, window shopped. I found a hat. I was looking through a bunch of hats. I love hats. I got way too many hats, and I've really cut back over the past 6 months about buying them. Saw an Atlanta Braves hat. $59.99. 59 American dollars and 99 American cents. What are we doing here? $60 for a hat. I remember when hats, this is not 1970s talk. I remember even about 3 or 4 years ago, the nicest hat you're going to get is about $35. How do we get to a point where that MLB is charging $60 for a stupid hat? 2 months ago, everyone was talking about there was that big hoopla about the crappy Fanatics and Nike uniforms that these two companies rolled out. The players were upset. They were ripping some of the pants were see through. Fans were complaining that some of the shirts they got, like the buttons were falling off. People online were saying you can definitely tell the difference of quality. These brand new 2024 t-shirts, replicas of their favorite team versus something they had bought like 3 or 4 years ago that was still good. I'm not telling Major League Baseball not to make money. I'm not telling any business not to make money. This podcast sells t-shirts, for goodness sakes. We're not trying to take advantage of people through insane pricing and putting out poor quality and charging the absolute most that these corporations think that you and me and everyone else is gonna stand is the way some of these people operate. Case in point, nothing to do with baseball, but everything to do with baseball. McDonald's. Everyone knows McDonald's. You probably haven't eaten McDonald's in a long time. I haven't eaten McDonald's in 1,000,003 years, but we've all eaten at McDonald's. So we know this company, corporation, ubiquitous with America, with the United States. They've had 2 consecutive years. In 2022, they raised their menu prices by 10%. In 2023, they then again raised their menu prices 10%. The president of McDonald's USA, a man by the name of Joe Erlinger, said, he wrote this in an open letter to investors, to shareholders, whatever. He said the average price of a Big Mac is up 27% from 2019. This isn't 1971 that it's up 27%. 2019, 5 years ago. Everyone's complaining and crying about inflation. This isn't inflation. This is pure greed. What is inflation now at 3-4%? In that same letter, this president Erlinger of McDonald's USA said that the price of medium French fries at McDonald's increased 44% over the past 5 years. I'm tired of people talking about inflation when it's just pure corporate greed. Major League Baseball isn't forcing you to buy this. I didn't buy that $59.99 Atlanta Braves hat. I scoffed at it. I was like, this is ridiculous. I would have bought it if it was $35. Here's my last point. Again, McDonald's, because we all know them. The CEO of McDonald's, not the president of McDonald's USA, the CEO, the head French fry, Chris, I can't even pronounce his name. I don't know. It's some name from somewhere on earth. Kempczynski, let's say it. Chris Kempczynski. Back in October of 2023, on an earnings call, he said, quote, even though we're pushing through pricing, the consumer is tolerating it well, end quote. This SOB is flat out telling you the consumer is tolerating it well. That means Chris K is trying to ram French fry prices every single year down people who eat McDonald's every single year. You can take 10% this year? You know what? Let's try to push it to 12% next year. Let's try to push it to 15% next year. And that's how you get a 44% increase in French fries. Hey, is this a baseball podcast or are we talking about fast food? What's going on here? That's my last point. Because if McDonald's, everyone's aware of it, if McDonald's has been acting like this for the past 5 years, you better believe Major League Baseball, Nike and Fanatics and New Era, they're all following suit when they're trying to see how much are you willing to pay for that St. Louis Cardinals hat? How much are you willing to pay for that Aaron Judge on-field authentic jersey? How much are you willing to pay for a Los Angeles Angels keychain? $12? $15? A keychain. It probably cost them 10 cents to manufacture in some godforsaken factory in communist China. Anyways, thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Thumbs down to the MLB flagship store and their insane pricing. You can go kick rocks, okay? MLB, I'm going to be saving my money and I'll be buying some college baseball hats and give it back to the programs to get these kids through college and all the great things they're doing. And by the way, college baseball World Series is happening today. We might crown a champion. But in the next segment, we aren't talking about fast food joints and price hikes. We'll talk about good old romantic baseball. This week, I'm pleased to be joined by our special guest, Sandra Marchetti, author of Aisle 228. Sandra, welcome to Last Call Baseball.
Thanks so much for having me, Dorian. The story, Dorian, the voice. I'm so honored to be with you.
Uh,
This is great. I think we'll have a very sonorous podcast actually today.
no pressure on me. I'm going to ask you this. Our seventh grade teacher made us memorize poems and then go in front of the class to recite them.
Mm,
My question to you, my ask to you is, could you please invent a time machine to go back in time to write your poetry books on baseball? Because it would have been a lot more interesting for me than having to remember Lord Byron
yes.
or Walt Whitman.
I wish I had a time machine. Either of those guys would be really tall tasks because the poems are so dang long. I think if you were forced to memorize a poem, my poems would be good because they're about 50 words. So it'd be maybe a little bit easier. But I think, the way poetry is taught, I think is something I've come up against as I've been marketing this book and sharing it with readers, is that there are tons of baseball fans out there who have come to my readings or bought a book and told me, like, I haven't bought a book since high school, or I haven't read a book since high school or college, or I've never bought a book of poetry, or I've never read poetry voluntarily. And part of what I was hoping this book would do would be to reach some audiences that normally would never pick up a book of poems. But I think that the way we teach poetry is just, it's really difficult. I could go into a lot of problems with the public school system and all of that. But I think it's safe to say that, writing things about what people enjoy and kind of trying to tap into these fandoms is something that is a really great opportunity for writers. And I think that, with this book, I've really seen that, you can put aside that idea of I don't like poetry if you're writing about an experience that people have had, and that they can connect to. They stop thinking of it as something they don't like. So that's been really fulfilling, actually.
Definitely. And in case it's not obvious, Aisle 228, Aisle 228 is a book on poetry, but it's inspired by baseball and specifically your love of the Chicago Cubs. And I think, and your father also has a big
Yes.
prominent, he's prominent throughout the poems in this book.
Yeah. Yeah. Like the elevator pitch on this book, and I probably should have said this before, but if I was going to give you the three-sentence summary, it's about, the Cubs ultimately culminating in the 2016 World Series, listening to baseball on the radio, and going to games with my father. It's sort of, if it helps you to think of it as sort of a memoir in verse rather than a book of poems, maybe that makes a little more sense to some folks. But
It's just hit me when you were saying that you're saying that your poems are about 50 words long. And I was obviously joking about Lord Byron and Walt Whitman and their pages and pages and pages of long poetry, but I'm thinking about poetry in the 20th century because your book
yeah.
that I read, it was probably the first book in the 21st century that I read about poetry. But then it hit
Right.
me some
Yeah.
poetry books that I've read in the past few years, like the poet, I don't know if he's still alive, he was from Miami, Donald Justice. And
Yes.
then there's
Yes.
another Miami based poem. He was the poet laureate for the Barack Obama's
Barack Obama.
inauguration, I believe in 2013. Richard,
Oh
uh,
my God.
I'll
I
have to,
am blanking on it too,
I'll have
but
to,
I'm looking at it.
I'll get my crack.
It's Richard
Huh,
Blanco.
yeah, I'll get my, yeah,
That's who
there
it
you go.
was.
I was
Yes.
gonna, you just saved work from my 100 interns here. And Donald Justice, Richard
Yes.
Blanco, they're very short, punchy poems. And then I
Yes.
was like, oh, well, yours are as well. Do you think there's a change in poetry
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
for this shorter concentration span,
Form.
or is it just like
Oh
this is
yeah.
the evolution of poetry?
Well, that's what the poets like to say. Like the living poets that I'm friends with are like, "Oh, we should be so popular right now because Instagram generation, TikTok, people have, you can read my poem one of my poems in a minute, so like this should really appeal to younger folks and the now sort of that we're living in." And I think in some ways we've seen that. There are certainly poems that have gone viral. Maggie Smith's "Good Bones" is one that has in the last maybe 5 years. You've mentioned a couple great poets that people should check out, Richard Blanco and Justice. But I guess I would say that I think there are people still writing long poems. I find my attention span really, really wanes. I struggle with that. I do some editing work and I read other people's books. And if they have poems that are longer than 2 or 3 pages, I get really tired or I forget. And I can read a novel, I can read a biography, but there's just something about that form that doesn't work for me. Yeah, I guess I would say. And I think what's great about poetry, though, is it takes all comers. There really is something for everybody. One of my favorite books written in the 21st century is Wild Hundreds, which is a book of poems. Ugh, I said it was one of my favorites, and now I'm blanking on all these names. But anyway, it has longer poems about the streets of Chicago and growing up on the South Side. And so, I think there really is something for everybody. But I think that it's hard because Nate Marshall wrote Wild Hundreds, but there really is something for everybody. But I think that it's just difficult because the money isn't necessarily there to publicize these things, and poetry books don't really make a lot of money. I think you're considered a roaring success if you can sell 1,000 copies of your book. We're never going to be in that Stephen King sort of stratosphere. Just really briefly taking it back, and I'll keep this history lesson super short because it'll be boring for people. But a lot of American poets and American literary theorists, shall we say, see poets from the US going really sort of through two veins. And I caution people on this because I think that we're leaving out a lot of people, but you're either sort of considered in the lineage of Emily Dickinson, who wrote extremely short poems, or in the lineage of Walt Whitman, who wrote these extremely long. Think of it as minimalism in architecture versus maximalism. And I mean, there's so much more, and this is really reductive. But the idea is that, for me, I consider myself more of a Dickinsonian than a Whitman type poet. So
I like that. I never thought that there were camps, almost like not ideologies too
yeah,
much, but it's
yeah,
almost camps.
yeah,
And I think of if I can't, for me, it was like if I can't write like John Keats, who was what a absolutely how would you call him, a comet
yes,
of 19th
right,
century English
yes,
poetry because he died when he was
yes,
like 24 or 25, insane,
yes,
some insane
yes,
guy was a genius. If only
right.
John Keats had written about cricket, I think more people would still because cricket is the cousin of baseball.
And there are poets who, way before me, wrote about games and sports. But I think for a long time it was really considered, I don't want to say taboo because I think that's the wrong word, but like if you're trying to become famous and serious and important as a literary icon, then are you really going to write about sports? And I think in the late half of the 20th century, latter half of the 20th century, and now the 21st century, poetry is really for everyone, like I've said, and you can write about pop culture. But I think before then, it was considered like, oh, that's just for fun, just like sports are in our culture, right? Like there are lots of intellectuals and very important people that maybe don't want to reveal their crazy sports fandom because it can maybe minimalize what you think about their intelligence or capabilities in some way. And I think for poets, that was the case. I mean, people like Marianne Moore or Annie Dillard, who was a great essayist, I mean, they were rabid baseball fans. But I think, especially for women writers, it was not acceptable to use like a game as the basic, what you wanted to write about, your topic. You had to write about something more important to get cred.
Minimalism, your book aisle 228, and baseball. I noticed that Ichiro, the great Japanese baseball player from the Seattle
Yes,
Mariners, is in
yes,
a handful of those of your poems in this book that came out last
yes,
year. I
yes.
think here's some constructive criticism. I think you missed your chance by not writing haikus for Ichiro. I'm teasing.
Well, I will tell you, I had a short little pamphlet of poems that were all Ichiro poems, and I offered it to a couple publishers, and I think the dearth of knowledge about Ichiro in the poetry community is really what stopped that up. But every baseball fan I talk to about this book, they're like, you need to write more poems about Ichiro because he's so poetic, and I agree. He's probably the most poetic baseball player
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
I've
So
ever seen.
where does that love of Ichiro? Because obviously, I believe you at least grew up or are from around the
Yes.
Midwest, the Chicago area, so that's why you're a big Chicago Cubs fan. But what about a team that's what, like 1,500 miles away in the rainy Northwest of the Seattle Mariners. What is
Yes.
it about Ichiro or the
Yes.
Mariners that you also love?
Well, you mentioned that Ichiro's in the book, and there are other players across the league. Some of your beloved former Braves appear in the book, right? And some of my favorite players, because I've heard you talk on the podcast before. You're part of the TBS generation, and for me, I'd watch the Cubs in the afternoon on WGN, and then I watched the Braves at night. And of course, this was before interleague play, so it has little to do with the Mariners. But I would say I am a baseball fan. I'm not just a Cubs fan. I'm really excited to watch the Rickwood Field game tonight, which is what I'm going to do as soon as we're done here. And I just think that I was part of that generation where late night West Coast baseball on ESPN was a thing. And I it really captured my imagination, especially as a kid. You know, stay up, and my parents were very lenient. But you'd stay up to watch the A's, and you'd watch that great three-headed monster of a rotation, or you'd watch Ichiro, you'd watch Ken Griffey Jr., on these games that ESPN would start at 9 o'clock Central Time, 10 p.m. Eastern. And so that's probably where it started, right? And I think I remember, in the mid 90s thinking about those Mariners teams. I remember talking to my father. I think there was a year, I believe there was a year where A-Rod, Randy Johnson, and Ken Griffey Jr. were all up for free agency in the same year. And I remember having this conversation with my father as basically a kid, being like, who can they re-sign? So I've always watched lots of baseball as much as I could. I also don't think I had cable until junior high, maybe. And so once we got cable, I was just like, I'm gonna watch every game that back in the days when it was all on cable. So
Yeah, but just with WGN and TBS, you get to watch basically the entire National League. But yeah, very little American League, as you said before.
yes.
I was about to say
Yes.
integration, but interleague
Oh
play.
boy. That's a whole nother topic.
That is. We
I
keep
definitely
talking.
didn't watch that.
Yeah, no. We keep talking about baseball and poetry. Would you like to read one of your favorite poets from the aisle 228 for us
Yeah.
so we can get a taste and we can be excited about the Rickwood game tonight and excited about the book?
Absolutely. So I'm going to read this poem that you kind of pointed out, which I rarely read when I do events with this book, because I think that a lot of people who come to poetry readings might not, unless they're real baseball fans, they wouldn't know the context of this poem. But it's called Sunday Night. And I think any listener to this podcast would know Tom Glavine was with the Mets when he got his 300th win. And I happened to go to that game at Wrigley Field, and I believe he was on the cusp of getting that 300th win for a few weeks. I mean, this was back when starting pitchers were getting more wins, but it was 3, 4, 5, 6. He had been after it for a little while. But it brings together a few different themes of the book, so I'll read it. Sunday Night. It was packed at Wrigley the night Glavine won his 300th. We were losing bad to his Mets for most of it. Maybe that's why you didn't want to applaud when he waved to the crowd, relieved. Cub fans cheering him easily. Like most, I have second favorites and thirds, guys to root for in October, but you wouldn't stand for history. If you haven't read the rest of the book, you maybe wouldn't know that the you in this book overall is my father, right? And so he, as a true Cubs fan, and we're united in this story. And I mean, you're a Braves fan. We hate the Mets. I mean, we all hate the Mets today on this podcast. So he was not willing to acknowledge. And I mean, maybe my dad had seen a 300th game won in real life before, but he wasn't going to clap for that. So
I like that one because there's a sense of humor towards the end. And I don't think that there's a lot of poems with that humor injected to it. That's one of the reasons that specific poem stood out to me.
that's great. Yeah. No, I mean, it kind of shows too, like the types of fans, right? Like, I feel like this could be a great comic strip about different types of baseball fans. You have the really super serious ones who, like he'll insist that any game he watches, the only team he ever roots for is the Cubs. So if he's watching, any other game, he has no rooting interest. Whereas I think I'm more like other normal people where pretty much in any game you're going to kind of take a side just for fun. Yeah. And so it kind of shows you the different types of people that are there, and also like the different sorts of feelings we have towards players, right? We think about more pro labor fans and more pro ownership fans, and like, can I respect Tom Glavine for everything he gave to the game? Or am I just, I don't care anymore because he's playing for the Mets and that's all that meant. You know what I mean? So I don't know. But I think that I'm glad you asked me to read that one because it's a little more, not to use a pun here, but inside baseball than some of the others.
Earlier, you said that you would watch the Braves on TV. Or you would come home, you'd watch obviously the
Yeah,
Cubs on WGN because I forget what year it that the Cubs finally installed lights in Wrigley Field and they were able to play at night because normally
1988.
right.
Yeah,
And but even then,
yeah,
even into the 90s, I remember that they
yes,
would start their games at 2:20 Central Time or
yes,
Eastern Time. I
yeah,
forget, somewhere in the
yes,
middle of
yes.
the
Two
day.
twenty, two
Yeah.
twenty Eastern.
So you would
Yeah.
come home, you watch it. Obviously, first thing you do, most kids do, is just turn on the television. You've told us one of the reasons you're a Cubs fan. Where did poetry come from?
Yeah. Okay. Good question. By the way, I think most Cubs fans who will be listening could tell you this, but there were all sorts of political reasons why the Cubs still had to have all these day games because they were Wrigley Field's in the neighborhood, and they were limited to, I think, 16 night games a year, or maybe at first it was 8 for maybe a couple decades. So they even with the lights, and fireworks has been another big fight. But the poetry thing, yeah. So I was always a kid who loved stories. I loved having stories told to me. I loved staying up late and watching David Letterman and listening to the monologue and the top 10 lists and all of that stuff. And I was sort of a performing kid, but I also liked to write little stories and draw cartoons. And I was an only child too. So, I had a lot of time to just sort of amuse myself. And so that's part of it. And then I think I did a lot of these different things. I wrote short stories and I drew and lots of creative pursuits. I was in, little plays and stuff like that. But poetry ended up sticking because I think I really do enjoy language in a really rich way. So like I'm the type of person, I'm weird. I think of certain words as soft or certain words as chewy or slippery. I like the sounds. I like the way we can put words together in interesting ways and tell really difficult to explain narratives or communicate really, I don't know, specific feelings with very few words. And I see it kind of as a puzzle to me. And I think a lot of us have hobbies, or I mean, for me, this is really my second career, but we do these sorts of things because they kind of, and I mean, sports goes right in this category. You get to play, you get to sort of solve these puzzles, you get to sort of constantly improve at something. It's something that you never get bored of because you can never really master it. And so I feel like that's why I'm still writing poems, and I ended up getting a graduate degree in writing poetry, and this is actually my second book, and my third book's coming out next year. So, this is something that I think captures my imagination and also gives you that ability to, or gives me that ability to have be in that flow state that so many creators talk about. Like, I think we wish maybe our day jobs would do that, but a lot of times they don't provide that. So we express that in other ways, or we get that time in other ways.
I do want to point out that your love of baseball is so much that you only lived in National League cities. Obviously, from Chicago area, the Chicago Cubs, and then when you went
Right.
to your master's degree, it was in the Washington D.C. area where the
Yes,
Nationals
that's
are, and
true.
so you were a
Yeah.
true National League
That is
supporter,
true.
woman.
That is true.
I love it. I'm a big. I always when the All Star game, which is going to happen in 3 weeks. I always root for the National League, even though more often than not they lose.
Yes, they lose. And I mean, with the All-Star game, right? We have the big long slumps for one team and then another team ends up winning for 20 years almost every game. And so that's kind of one of my hot takes, I would say, is they do need to bring back wearing your own team's uniform, right, in the All-Star game.
I'm gonna
So,
keep
but I think
surf.
we can all agree on that.
I'm gonna keep surfing the hot take. I noticed that you have an
Okay.
affiliation, not affiliation, excuse me, an affinity for the
Yes.
Muppets.
Yes, I love the
Who
Muppets.
is the best poet amongst all the Muppets?
Oh my goodness. Wow. I don't even know. That's a deep pull, Dorian. Like, I'm not even sure how you found that out.
I would go. I love the Muppets, the movies, and all that. I think who was it? I think isn't Miss Piggy that has like little quips here and there. I think she would
Yes.
be a good hip hop artist slash poet. And
Yes.
I'm also partial to the Fraggle Rock. They
Oh,
they
yes.
also had there's too many of them to stand out. Where the Muppets the characters stand out, but Fraggle Rock there's just so many. They're almost like the new Fraggle Rock are those what is it, the minions of that movie.
Yes.
There's just too
Right.
many of them.
Yeah.
Like, but
There's
yeah, the
way too
Muppets.
many minions to have
Yeah,
their own individual
that's kind of
personality.
like
But
that's like
I think
the Fraggle Rock.
Miss Piggy could be like the Kendrick Lamar. She could master the diss track. I mean, I just see that. And I totally agree with you. But I guess I would say, I don't know, Janice. Janice is very like poetic in that typical way where she's sort of flighty, she's into crystals, and she has like she could say something and you'd be like, that's part of a poem, isn't it, Janice? Right? Like something about a butterfly or whatever. But I think there are some secret poets hanging around within the Muppets. I think Fozzie, when he gets sort of sad, he if you can make a joke, you can make a poem.
Yeah,
So I think that
and
that
he's
could
in
work.
touch with his emotions as well. He doesn't
Yes, he's in
try
touch
to
with his
suppress them.
emotion.
If you're
Yes.
able to title a poem, you don't have to make up a poem, but just something of like a
Okay.
title of a poem for the
Okay.
2024 Chicago Cubs season, because we're about halfway through. They started off really well, and
Oh,
then they
yes.
just all I hear
April was great.
when you go on Twitter, it's like the world is ending. It's the end
Yes.
of Rome amongst
Yes.
the Cubs
Rome
Twitter
is
sphere.
burning. Yes.
What would be a title so far? Because we're only 45% of the way done with the Chicago Cubs, but
uh, I think the poem I want to write, and I don't know, maybe I can come around to a title, but let me describe it, is something about Craig Counsell laying in bed thinking, yes, I'm really rich now, but my mental health has deteriorated to such a state that like the pressure was off in Milwaukee. I was, yes, things weren't great there. We didn't have all the money in the world, but we kept winning. I knew how to do it. And now I'm here and there's more press and there's more angry people. And I kind of hate this. And my press conferences and my answers, like, it's not enough for anybody. So something about Craig Counsell laying awake at night, I think.
I like that point. But you know what? In defense of Milwaukee, he
Yeah.
came to a historically relevant
Hmm.
organization like the Chicago Cubs, but a team
Hmm.
that it's no longer 2014, it's 2024, where the Ricks family
Yes.
does not want to spend like the Chicago Cubs are probably one of the top three, top five revenue earners in the league, but they're
Hmm.
not. They're spending kind of like I don't want to say Tampa Bay Rays, but they're probably spending like the Milwaukee Brewers. Like the Brewers and the
Well,
Cubs
I
are in
think
different stratospheres.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. And if you look at the payrolls in the NL Central, the Cubs have the highest payroll in the NL Central, but it's also about roster building and team building. It's not just about the amount of money that's been put into it. They haven't spent the money real wisely. I mean, there's a lot of homegrown talent on this team too, actually, which is great. But on the other hand, like, some of the pitchers that are actually our starting pitching has been fantastic all year. I really, for the most part. And a lot of those guys are cheap and controllable, or they're on kind of short-term deals. Like Jamison Tyon's only on a 3-year deal, I think. So you would think like, oh, why is the payroll $233 million for this. Craig Counsell's getting paid this much for this. And that almost makes it even more disappointing because you're just like, well, and I know you love to talk about Paul Skeens, but there are other teams in this division too that their payrolls are less than half. They're 84 million, 100 million.
The
So
Reds, let's just say it, the Reds.
yeah, yes. And I mean, they never spent. So, I don't know. I just think it's misguided. I think that maybe the payroll is high enough, like maybe it's sixth, seventh, eighth in baseball, but it's the way they've spent the
That's a
money.
good point.
Ugh,
That's a good point.
yes. Yeah.
So as obviously you love the Cubs, but if you were able to put the pen down for maybe the next 10 years and you
Hmm.
become the new commissioner of Major League Baseball, what's what new initiatives would
Yes.
Commissioner Marchetti bring to the game?
Well, I'm gonna say this, and I would have no ability to do this except if I pulled a Bud Selig when he instated like Frank Robinson. But Kim Ang gets a job. She gets a job somewhere, and she gets the job that she deserves, because that woman's been through enough. But that's the first thing. I've really come around on the pitch clock. I really like it. We barely even look at it anymore. I have no issue with that. I don't like the Ghost Runner, but I also don't really like 16 inning or 18 inning games outside of the playoffs. So I don't really know what the solution is, but I think the Ghost Runner, there's work to be done there, right? I do think MLB needs real help. I'm going to go in a different direction than rules changes and just talk about marketing. And I just think that all these sports leagues copycat each other and they think what's going to work for the NFL is going to work for Major League Baseball. And that is just so wrong. Like, we know that baseball has this really wonderful regionalism. And instead of trying to nationalize it and trying to make people care about things maybe they don't, like, I think really digging into that. That's why I think that these events like this Rickwood Field game are great, like really talking more about history. And I think that all the Negro League stuff is really welcome and fresh. And I think that there are opportunities to get rid of blackouts, right? And so, like, you could be a fan of the Mariners and live in Chicago and just let that person in Chicago be a Mariners fan. Like, let them watch those games and have access to all that stuff. So that would definitely be first on my agenda. And I guess I have other ideas, but I did write a poem and you can find it online, and it's about the one thing I really hated was 7 inning doubleheaders during COVID. So I'm glad that they got rid of that, even though I know the players liked it. But I have a poem about that and the Ghost Runner online, and I'll I'll look up the title of it because it's really long and say it right before we end this.
Yeah,
So
I do like your point about somehow shoehorning, which is in a good way. Kim In Ing, I can never pronounce her last name, but the former
and
general
yeah, I
manager
think
of the Miami Marlins, I
yes.
think she would be absolutely perfect for the San Diego Padres. The club,
Ooh,
Peter Sellers, rest in peace. He went to the
yes,
great beach, San Diego beach in the sky, but that
yes,
club has shown for years a willingness to spend that city's hungry for a championship, and
yes,
AJ Preller has done a very mediocre job, and
yes,
he still has a job over like 12 years, and I think they've been to the playoffs twice as general
yeah,
manager. That's completely unacceptable. She and her coming from the shoestring budget of the Miami Marlins and Bruce
yeah,
Sherman
right,
going
right.
to fiscal heaven, San Diego Padres would be a match made in heaven.
But she's also worked for the Yankees, so she's done that too. And
But
I
not
just
as a general manager because they're never going to
no.
fire Cashman. So
But what I'm saying is that she would have a good idea how to spend more money and spend it decisively and make the right trades. So I would love to see that. I think that's a
virtual
great
high
fit.
five. I like that. All right. Oh,
The name of the poem, I just want to mention it really quickly, is Against 7 inning doubleheaders and starting runners on second base in extra innings in Major League Baseball.
to the
And
point.
you can just Google my name
It's very to the
and
point.
you'll
I like
find
it.
it. Yeah.
We're both going to watch the Rickwood game tonight, but we're not going to be able to
Yes.
actually be there. But when we're at a baseball
Right.
stadium and we don't need we eat food. But
Yes.
in the Chicago area, where are some of your favorite go-to places to have coffee, a drink, food that
Yes.
you enjoy?
Well, so I'm going to try to make this quick, but I have to say a couple different things. So, in Wrigleyville, where I don't live, but I go to often, there is a fantastic restaurant that knocks out a lot of the things on your list. Cafe Tola, they have a few locations. They have the best empanadas. They're fantastic. And they have empanadas in all different flavors. So if you think you don't like empanadas, just get the buffalo chicken one. Get the apple streusel, the hot apple pie one. Like you like them. It's fried. It's a fried dumpling with stuff in it. But they have fantastic coffee. They have a horchata latte, which is not really my thing, but they're known for that. They make a great oat milk cappuccino, which is what I like to drink. And then out by me, I live out in the Western Burbs, which is kind of the not cool area. But I will say thin crust tavern style pizza is really the thing we like to eat here in Chicago more than deep dish. We do like our deep dish, but it's kind of a once in a while thing. And Papa's Pizza has the best thin crust sausage pizza. I love it. It's in Woodridge, so definitely check that out.
I wouldn't say that the western suburbs are uncool because I believe that Ferris Bueller lived there and he's one of the
Yeah,
coolest
yeah.
dudes I know.
Yeah. Well, the Northwest, he lived in the northern suburbs, but yeah, I mean for sure. But that just illustrates all the trouble you need to get up to have fun, I think, in the burbs. But
I love 80s movies.
oh yeah,
Sandra, thank you so much for joining us. Let us know where we
of
can find
course.
your book, where we can find you online, social media, anything you want to share with us.
Yes. So the book is available anywhere books are sold. You can go to Amazon, Barnes and Noble, anywhere that you buy books, bookshop.org. Also, the publisher is Texas A&M Press. So if you go to, just Google Texas A&M Press, it's affiliated with the university. And then you can get the book there. That's really easy. You can definitely follow me on social media. I'm just like everyone, I think, way too active on Twitter, live tweeting. I'm gonna have a lot of Olympics live tweets upcoming because the Olympics are also one of my favorite sporting events. And I'm at Sandra Poetry on Twitter. I'm at Sandra Poetry on Facebook, Sandra M Poetry on Instagram, and anywhere else. So yeah, come find me.
Because this week I had Premium Pills, an original German Pilsner from Bitburger Brewery in Bitburg, Germany. It's a good summer beer. I'm going to have all of Sandra's websites in the show notes. And of course, this is corporate last call baseball talk here. We're going to have all of our websites where you can find the moderately priced t-shirts, all our social media, rate and review, all that stuff. Thanks for listening to Last Call Baseball. Be great and get home safe.